Okay, welcome back. We're back into the intro to ethics part of our Philosophy 101 course. We've ended the memes in the pre-show so that we don't get copyright strict on YouTube anymore because they're very, very vigorous over there. So here's where we're at. We're in section 4 of 8 of our intro course. And we started by going over the deontological essay. And then last class, we actually did the intro to this whole section. So if we can add that back in here, we'll refresh our memories. There are these moral terms and moral statements and moral disagreements. It's not clear the nature. So we notice that Edwards is going to try to focus on this one question of the sort of the nature of moral statements. What separates a statement of nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition or Napoleon, invaded on such and such a date, where you understand how you could go about looking for the facts to support or oppose such a statement, with a statement like Napoleon was a bad guy, or I don't like Napoleon, or Napoleon was a hero, or something like that. So these statements of value and these moral statements, which use these other terms. So we said that ethics is separated into, we could decide to think of it as these intertwining sections of subsections of ethics, where we just look at ethical questions, or we look at the foundations for how we could build an ethics, or we look at something called meta ethics, which is what we're going to focus on mostly here because Edwards is mostly interested in the nature of these statements, which is a meta ethical thing, or the summum bonum, which is, like we said, the ultimate good. So we won't go into all these details again, but we talked about that. And then he wants to get into this subjective versus objective, and he drew a distinction between a few other things. So we'll get rid of that, and let's get into it. So this will be our second essay while we explore it, and the title is Science and Ethics. I'm assuming nobody's read it because we've kind of been out of the sync of things, and some of us don't have the book. So I figured these are short essays, and we'd just read them as a part of the class. Everybody's on board with that, right? Or did anybody read this already and would just like to discuss it? I think it'd be better if we start putting the text into our classes. So I'm just going to read it unless there's an objection. Okay, so Science and Ethics by Bertrand Russell. The framing of moral rules, so long as the ultimate good is supposed known, is a matter for science. So he's saying if we already know what the ultimate good is, we just need science to sort out the details. It's sort of a Sam Harris approach in a sense there. For example, should capital punishment be inflicted for theft or only for murder or not at all? Okay, we don't have to add Jen there. I know we're having tech issues here, but hopefully. All right, good. So we see that it's okay. So we got Bertrand Russell, and if we're not already familiar with his name, we're going to get more familiar with it. But it's not surprising that he's coming at it from a leaning towards materialism, but definitely a scientism attitude. And he's saying if we already know what the ultimate good is, suppose that we know that, then everything else in ethics would be a matter for science. For example, should capital punishment be inflicted for theft or only for murder or not at all? There's a question. Jeremy Bentham, who considered pleasure to be the good, devoted himself to working out what criminal code would most promote pleasure and concluded that it ought to be much less severe than that prevailing in his day. All this, except the proposition that pleasure is the good, comes within the sphere of science. All right, so he's setting up to say, look, as far as the foundations go, I'm not sure. He hasn't proposed anything yet. But if we know what the ultimate good principle is, everything else is a matter of investigating within science. We can shut that off now. Memes are done. Okay. But when we try to be definite as to what we mean when we say that this or that is the good, and he's using capital G there, good, we find ourselves involved in very great difficulties. Bentham's creed that pleasure is the good roused furious opposition and was said to be a pig's philosophy. Neither he nor his opponents could advance any argument. In a scientific question, Evidence can be adduced on both sides, and in the end, one side is seen to have the better case, or if this does not happen, the question is left undecided. But in a question as to whether this or that is the ultimate capital G good, there is no evidence either way. Each disputant can only appeal to his own emotions and employ such rhetorical devices as shall rouse similar emotions in others. All right. So he's not only saying, notice how much he's understanding this in a way that wouldn't actually disagree with a great deal of other camps, right? He's saying we need to be oriented towards something. And then he's saying we can't use science to figure out what that thing is. Science rules, once we've got that, it'll tell us all the answers, and we can go and investigate it that way, but it can't tell us what we should be aimed at in the first place. And then he says, he's making a positive assertion here. He's saying, in order to settle that, since science doesn't work, there is no other way. All it is just people emoting. Right? That's he's asserting that, right? He hasn't necessarily demonstrated it yet that there aren't other ways of approaching it, but that's his attitude. Take, for example, a question which has come to be important. Let's see if I can edit this here. Is my mic coming in too strong? That's probably fine. I'll turn the headphones down. Bentham held that one man's pleasure has the same ethical importance as another man's, provided the quantities are equal. And on this ground, he was led to advocate democracy. Nietzsche, on the contrary, held that only the great man can be regarded as important on his own account, and that the bulk of mankind are only means to his well being. He viewed ordinary men as many people view animals. He thought it justifiable to make use of them, not for their own good, but for that of the Superman. And this view has since been adopted to justify the abandonment of democracy. We won't go into whether or not that's an accurate analysis of Nietzsche. We'll just say, okay, whatever. Even if it's not, he's set up that as an idea, and he's going to say, how are we going to try to argue between such approaches? Somebody could have an idea like that. I'm not saying it's not an accurate depiction of nature. We're just not going to go into that. All right. We have here a sharp disagreement of great practical importance, but we have absolutely no means. This is his assertion, right? No means of a scientific or intellectual kind by which to persuade either party that the other is in the right. There are, it is true, ways of altering man's opinions on such subjects, but they are all emotional, not intellectual. So he's going to the realm from his metaphysical analysis. He's going to the realm of foundations, and he's saying you can't ground it in anything except people arguing and making emotional appeals. Questions as to values, quote unquote, that is to say, what is good or bad on its own account, independently of its effects, lie outside the domain of science, as the defenders of religion emphatically assert. Right? Again, you see the agreement there. I think that in this they are right, but I draw the further conclusion, which they do not draw, that questions as to values lie wholly outside the domain of knowledge. That is to say, when we assert that this or that has value, we are giving expressions to our own emotions, not to a fact, which would still be true if our personal feelings were different. To make this clear, we must try to analyze the conception of the good. So let's pause there for a moment. It's pretty clear. He's spelled out his position, and he's going to expand upon it and flesh it out a little bit more, and we'll read that. But let's pause there. I'm not going to provide an argument for or against it, but I want to open up some discussion before we move on. So it's not just reading straight through. So we know what he said. He said, "Look, first of all, if we were all agreed about what was good, like let's say we all agreed the greatest amount of pleasure is good, and so if some action causes pain to one person but pleasure to 10,000, then that would be ethically good because the ultimate good is increasing pleasure, perhaps, or something like that." Then if we were agreed on that, he thinks settling all ethical questions would be easy. It would be a matter of science. We would have to go and investigate and say, okay, is this action likely to lead to a greater amount of happiness or pleasure or utility or usefulness or it's utility or whatever it was that we were all settled on being the ultimate good, even if it was just one principle. If we were all settled on it, then ethics would be a matter for science. However, he says, I agree with the religious people that you can't use science to figure out what the ultimate value is, what you should be aiming at, the summum bonum, the highest principle, the thing that we should be working towards. We can't settle that scientifically. The religious, they think that they've got stuff to say about it beyond that, he says, but I disagree with that part. I think so obviously we could so here's a good word that we could learn here. Um an enthymeme. An enthymeme is a syllogism with one part not explicitly expressed, right? So if he says this will be worth looking at because we can just put a little bit of logic class in here. Say, okay, if all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, Socrates is mortal. That's an example of a syllogism. It's premise, premise, conclusion. The conclusion follows from the premises. But an enthymeme would be something like this: all men are mortal, Socrates is a man. And then I don't say anything else after that. And because I haven't said anything else after that, um, you can fill in the blank. Like the whole syllogism's still there. I'm just not explicitly saying one part of it. Or I could say Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. I didn't say the first premise, but clearly that's implied, right? Like I'm just only uttering two of the three statements, but it's a powerful way of sort of underlining what I mean. So, in any case, what he's saying here is an enthymeme. He's saying we can use science to settle all the particular questions of ethics if only we could all be agreed on what the aim should be, that we should be aimed at this good, whatever that good is, obeying the laws of God, even if that was it and we were all saying, hey, there's a God and we want to all obey his creeds. Well, then we could use science and we could use analysis of historical documents and we could try to figure out what his commands are and say, do these actions align with it or do they not? Right? It would be like having a bunch of lawyers. We could work it out. Might take a lot of time. Or we could say increasing happiness is the ultimate good for conscious creatures. And then we could have a billion little debates but we could settle it and science would let us do that. But Bertrand Russell is saying, um, he's saying, unfortunately, science can't help us settle what that ultimate good is. And then he's saying, therefore, there is no way of settling it. So the enthymeme is science can't help you there. Therefore, there's no way of knowing it. Well, so the implied premise is the only way of knowing things is scientifically, right? So he says, look, I agree with the religious people. Science isn't going to settle what the ultimate good is. I disagree with them that there is any way to settle it, therefore, because science, to Bertrand Russell, he hasn't said this, so we won't be unfair to him, but it might be something like the right way of thinking, right? The only right way of thinking, something like that. And since that's necessary for the syllogism to make sense, it's not unfair to at least tentatively say, well, that's basically the point he's trying to make or his position. We don't ever want to try to put ideas into other thinkers, but one of the things in the history of philosophy and the course of philosophy is that we'll be reading Socrates, we'll be reading excerpts or I'm sorry, remnants of what's left over from the writings of guys like Heraclitus or something like that. And one of the rules is don't imagine they believe something that would contradict anything you know for sure they believed, but also you kind of have to assume that they're intelligent, they meant what they said, and then look for the implications of what they said as if they were consistent in what they believed, because it's just something that you kind of have to do when you're wrestling with philosophical ideas. And there's this nice, interesting overlapping synthesis necessity of doing the history of philosophy when you do philosophy, and that's a small part of what we do when we do that. So, in any case, we're going to read Bertrand Russell. And we're going to say, okay, he's saying, look, science can't help you figure out the ultimate good. Therefore, there is no knowledge to be found there. Well, implied in that is that science is the only way to do that. So, to get any kind of useful knowledge or real knowledge. So I'm going to pause there and say, okay, he's admirably setting up. Okay, you're back in again. Let me add you there. I don't know if you could hear what we were saying before, but I know you're having technical issues. But in any case, now that it's been set up and he's been admirably clear about his position, let's pause there for a second and open it up to a group discussion. Um, his position is science would be all we would need. Let's call science the rules of right investigative thinking for settling specific questions. And that's all we would need to settle all ethical questions if we could only be agreed about what we should be aimed at as the ultimate good. And then he says, unfortunately, science can't help us to determine what the ultimate good is. One man says it's this, another man says it's that, but science can't, there's no investigation you can do to say, hey, you should be aimed at this versus that. And then he says, therefore, there's no way to settle it. And the only things people are doing when they're arguing about first principles on this is emoting, right? They're using persuasion, they're using rhetoric, they're appealing to people's emotions, they're expressing their emotions, but they're not dealing in the realm for Bertrand Russell of knowledge. So I'm going to pause there and ask a question if anybody wants to jump in on this and say, can you imagine another way of trying to get to knowledge that wouldn't be called scientific if we define scientific broadly as the rules of right thinking based in investigating things that are evidential, things we can measure, something like that. Right. So if he's got a pretty broad definition of science, he's saying science works to settle these questions, but it can't settle the first question of what we should have as our highest aim. Do you agree with Bertrand Russell and say, yeah, that seems pretty clear? Like what people are aimed at is just what they're aimed at. I mean, how are you going to argue they should be aimed at something else? You're going to go tell an anteater it should be aimed at building cathedrals? Or are you going to go tell a human it should have different values than it has? What are you going to base that in? Did you discover a tablet? Did you discover something in their DNA? How are you going to use science to figure out what they should be aimed at? So there's a few responses. You could say, well, I'm gonna take a poll and see who here is inclined to think any of the following, because one of these I think would have to be a response to what he's saying. A, you're completely correct, Bertrand Russell. I see clearly you agree with the religious. I agree with you. There is no way of settling that with the normal rules of right thinking applied to investigative, evidential based inquiry. And so it must just be emotion. Or two, to say, maybe actually we could use exactly that method and look for evidence and say, well, there's something written in your DNA code that says you should be aimed at this. I mean, it seems like that wouldn't really work. I think maybe he's onto something, but perhaps you think you could find it scientifically, and that he and the other religious people he's agreeing with are wrong to think that science has nothing to say about that. Or could you say, I think you're right. You can't use science to get that question answered, but there's other ways of settling that question. And you could still have knowledge in that realm. And then what would that be? If you want to put forward something like that. Or D, any other type of response. Does anybody have just yeah, no one's going to be held to this in the future, but what do you think about his assertion that science can't help us settle what we should be aimed at, even though it can settle all of the particular questions once we have our aim? Does anybody agree, disagree, think he's onto something?
Yeah, I would. I mean, you'd use rationalism or empiricism to discover that, rather than science for the greater good.
So I think he would say empiricism usually makes you think of science, but rationalism is definitely alternative. So I like what you're saying there. Say, okay, well, look, you don't have to be empirical and scientific about it. Why not look at the proposed aims and see if they're self-contradictory or if they come to unwanted conclusions or something? Like, why not just use philosophy to try to weed out between all the proposed aims? And you don't need to, collect evidence to do that. You can just use rationality to say, hey, this idea don't make no sense. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, you could use empiricism in the acquired from personal experiences. So, example of two scenarios where, hey, this worked because of a reason, and this didn't work in this other situation, for whatever reason. So I think in that aspect that could certainly be helpful, but I would agree you would lean more towards rationalism.
So let me ask you to clarify on that. That's a really cool idea. So I think Bertrand Russell says, yeah, we can use empiricism to settle specific questions. Like let's say the law banning all guns will reduce violence in the society, and that's a good thing to do. And then we do a comparative political analysis and we say, here's all the countries that banned guns and whether or not their violence went up or down as a result. And we say, because that sounds like what you're saying, oh, we can empirically say, hey, this worked or this didn't work in that sense. He says, of course, we can do that. But we first have to agree that reducing violence is a good thing to do. How can we use empirical science to do that? How could we approach that in the same way, right? If we're aimed at reducing violence, then we can say, oh, we can measure whether or not this helped. But can we use empiricism to settle on the idea that reducing violence would be good? What if some lunatic came along and said, hey, the the greatest ideas are always and the greatest futures are always born out of conflict. So we should be increasing violence or the right sort of violence because that's when you're going to get the rubber meets the road and we'll have magical existentially better futures. That's sort of his idea of what Nietzsche was suggesting, or that's at least a similar caricature of what people think of as Nietzsche's approach. I'm not saying that's correct, but if somebody came along and said that, wouldn't that overturn the whole table of us sitting here saying, "Hey, we empirically verified that this action, we thought it would decrease violence, but it increased violence." Somebody else comes along and says, "You're aiming at the wrong thing. You shouldn't be trying to decrease violence." Can we use empiricism
Well,
to
I
tell them they're
mean,
wrong?
sure, I would argue the other way and say, well, if everyone's a threat, then everyone's going to be much more conscious of uh, being violent, because then there's the much higher chance of a repercussion of the consequences. There's going to be violence upon you and someone defending themselves.
Yeah, and this crazy philosopher says, "That's what I want. I want sharp people, people on their toes." That's the type of people that come up with great futures and build wonderful things. They're aimed at the good because they're always working, worried about what's coming next. Maybe make so one suggestion I think you're trying to make here, and I think you could be right, is saying, well, let's just look at whether or not that makes things better. You're asserting that that would be better. Does that really make things better? Maybe you're a lunatic and maybe you're wrong, and that would be an empirical approach to trying to negate that cartoonish idea that we put forward. But what if somebody said, well, I don't want, like, your way of measuring better is wrong. I think the world would be better if one person was liberated into ultimate free consciousness. And to do that, we need famine, plague, earthquake, disaster, catastrophe, and constant violence all around. Be like, shit. Okay, well, when I'm measuring how badly the society looks, you say, no, that's how good the society looks. You like you see the same evidence as pointing in the opposite direction. How can we settle that first principle of what would be good in the first place?
So you're saying is it's too subjective.
Well, that's what he's saying, right? Yeah, he's saying, look, you're not going to settle that empirically. You're just going to emote. You're going to express your biases, your opinions, your culturally ingrained attitudes, your feelings. I think that seems bad. I think that seems good. How can you settle that? If two people come in and say, I think famine seems like a horrible thing. We should try to reduce it and minimize it as much as possible. Someone else comes in and says, I think that's great. The Pharaoh himself is God, and all of this is to serve his consciousness. And so the more he has to wrestle with as billions or let's say hundreds of thousands of people die of starvation, the more intensely he'll be wrestling with his divine nature. And like, holy shit, okay, maybe that sounds stupid or maybe we don't like it, but can we settle it empirically? Can we say, no, I discovered something in the world that proves you're wrong about that? We should be trying to feed people well rather than letting them starve for some other greater good you imagine.
Well, I mean, I suppose you could say, well, why don't we start with you when you show me an example of how great famine is? And if it's so great, then we'll continue to spread because you're going to tell everyone how great of an experience it is. So I
So you
certainly,
mean make him convince people?
well, yeah, and say, well, if you're all for it, then why don't you lead the way? Let's show us
Okay,
how it's done.
okay, good. I like this. So that's fantastic. But doesn't that reduce us to exactly what Bertrand Russell is saying we're in this situation of? He's saying we're going to vote based on our emotions. You're not going to convince anybody if you have that crazy an idea. And so we'll just keep going. But isn't he still therefore correct that we never gave an argument to that person? We never had a reason to persuade him. We just said, "Hey, we all think you're wrong and we're going to try to reduce famine. You can go try to increase it if you want, but none of us are on your side." Isn't that us not giving an argument, but just saying, "Well, we'll never settle this because we feel this way and you feel that way." Isn't that us admitting that Bertrand Russell was certainly right, that there's no evidentiary way of settling first principles like that?
Yeah, yes, but as far as the famine is concerned, you can say, well, we know what happens. I mean, people can starve to death. You don't have water for 7 days. I mean, you're gonna die. Or
Exactly.
you can have
Hooray. Hooray, says this lunatic philosopher. He says, "That's what I was hoping for. That means that the pharaohs really got to manifest the raw divinity because look at all these dying people. That's exactly what I wanted. We're closer to the good. If everything was good, we'd just be like dumbly doing nothing and he'd have nothing to rule over or care about or so yeah, hooray, hooray, more people dying, says this ridiculous philosopher. Where's your argument and evidence going to be to tell him you're out of your mind, man?
well, you can say when you're dead, you'll be a perfect example. We'll just wait seven
Oh,
days when you're dead, and then we'll see that, look, what a horrible idea this was. It only took a week to prove to everybody that this is obviously a bad idea.
so for anybody who thinks that that's not a good argument, what Savad just said, that is absolutely a profound pragmatic approach. That's the William Jamesian way of thinking. So you can think that all you want, and if it leads you to dying, nature, the cosmos have consequences for how wrong your idea is. Maybe that's the evidence that you're wrong. The evidence that you're wrong is that think about it that way and you don't thrive in life and your philosophy dies with you because it was in your head. Right? That's actually really touching on the American invention of pragmatism would have an answer to that, which would be very much like what you just said. I think maybe exactly like what you just said. Actually, I shouldn't even use the word like, which is to say, look, you can interpret, um, you can interpret Shakespeare to mean that everyone should immediately run to the nearest bridge and jump off of it. If you want that interpretation, go ahead. I mean, you're not gonna be around next week to make the argument. I mean, isn't that the evidence that your interpretation wasn't a good way of living? Like it wasn't like the question of ethics is how should we live? And your interpretation is something that brings you to demise. So it's proven wrong when you follow it and die. There's something more there than it might sound when because we're not used to thinking like pragmatists, but the pragmatists would absolutely come into the conversation in exactly the way Savad just said, with their big beards and their very serious, stoical faces, and they would be like, "Sure, go ahead, think that all you want." Like, I'm not going to provide the argument against it. Nature will provide the argument against it. You won't be here, and that will be the evidence that your answer to the question, "How should we live?" was flawed because you're no longer living. There's something to that perhaps. All right, let's pause on that. And Mark, you unmuted. What would you like to say?
Yeah, I think we would, going back a little further, I don't think science itself can define what's good and what's evil. I think that is an empirical determination that we come to based on the good old golden rule.
Okay. I'm sorry,
This,
go ahead.
I don't like to be treated this way, therefore I won't treat other people this way, etc.
Excellent.
Um,
Fantastic.
but
So I'm gonna mm,
scientifically, I don't know how you would determine that. So go ahead.
fantastic. So a moment ago we added a little logic term. We talked about enthymemes just because we had an excuse to smuggle that into what we're talking about. Right now, what we're going to do is we're going to smuggle in nailing down the definitions of certain words. And this conversation has given us an opportunity to do that because I think the word empirical might be misused by us because we're using it all the time. So I'm just going to give what I think is the definition of it. And if I'm wrong, we can come back next time and tell me that I'm wrong. To me, the word empirical means exactly, don't take this as an insult. I think it means exactly the opposite of the way you meant to use it, or what the point you were making there. Empirical means is based in something that I can sense and measure. And what you're saying is, look, it's not based in something like that. It's based in, I mean, maybe I misheard you, so I'm not trying to put you on the spot as the bad example or something. But it's not based in that. It's based in something like the golden rule, right? The golden rule isn't something, unless you agree with the deontologists we read before, who say, well, you have a moral faculty. You actually, like, you can see red and you can see yellow. You have a conscience and you can feel something is wrong or something is right, as long as that conscience is cultivated properly, and blah, 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 with a lot of caveats. So maybe you do mean empirical in that sense, which is like, no, I'm using my eyes to see the objects on the table, and I'm using my moral faculty to see that this is wrong and that I shouldn't do unto others what would be abhorrent if done unto me, say. But if you're using empirical that way, then maybe that's empirical. But when you say the second part of what you said, which again, I think I might agree with, so this isn't disagreement with what you're saying. It's like, no, no, no. It's not empirical in the sense that you could go and discover something that would be like in my microscope or in my telescope that tells me this is true. It just has to be founded in a principle like that, which I affirm is correct. Well, the religious people say, and many philosophers, most maybe, would say, yeah, well, we can get to a first principle like that through reason and rationality and argument. So I just want to highlight rationality and empirical, rational versus empirical. They're different. Okay. They're actually a distinction. If you're going to say empirical, what you mean is it's rooted in something that I felt and discovered and saw and measured and tasted, something like that. If it's rational, it means, look, I could be a brain in a vat, but I can think about it enough to realize 2 plus 2 is 4. Or I could at least think about it enough to know 2 plus 2 is either 4 or it's not 4, and it can't be both. Right? I could use my rationality. I don't have to go and feel something in the world. So empirical just means ultimately this is based in something I can discover, measure, write down. And so you can go discover it too, give you a map of where to get to. Whereas rational means I can understand it's true just in my mind without investigating the world. So sorry for that, but it's a good opportunity for us to sort of be sharp about how we're using our words. But that wasn't your main point. And your main point, I think, was a good one, which is if you would like to resay it, I think what you were saying, and I'll restate it back to you so that you can jump in and correct me and expand upon it a little bit, was that this ultimate first principle thing is not something that is like an empirical truth. It's something that we certainly need as a foundation, but we're not going to get to it that way. We're going to get to it through understanding basic moral principles. And basic moral principles are ideas, they're rational, and we can figure them out maybe, and we can argue and philosophize or discover them in revelation or whatever, but they're rational ideas that are things as simple as, I think you gave the golden rule. Like, okay, if you're violating the golden rule, you're out. How do I know? Because I'm using my brain, not I'm using my senses. Empirical means I'm using my senses. Rational means I'm using my brain. That's retarded. That's stupid. Don't go doing to others what you would be protesting if it was done unto you, and think that you're being a coherent, rational, non contradictory moral agent. You're being absurd, right? That's sort of one way of understanding that principle from a rational perspective. Now, of course, you can analyze it empirically, right? You could say, here are the cultures that preach that value of the golden rule, that care about it. Here's a group of people, maybe psychopaths, who don't seem to understand it or operate according to it. And let's look at the consequences of the lives of these individuals and these cultures, right? It doesn't mean we're banning empirical investigation. But the question for Bertrand Russell and for you and for I and in this discussion is, can we get to that first principle through empiricism, through examining the world and measuring things? Or if you're not Bertrand Russell, can you get there rationally, or can you get there through revelation? And then there's this overlap, which maybe Mark agrees with, actually, from our deontologists, who say, no, you can get there empirically if you just recognize that you have another sense. Just like you have smell and taste and sight and hearing, you have a moral sense, and your conscience is pricked, or you admire actions that are consistent with the golden rule, right? So you can sense that there's value there, just like you can sense when you're seeing green or red or something like that with your eyeballs. Um, it- am I being coherent? Uh, would you do us a favor of just now that I've gone off on that tangent of just bringing us back to the conversation and restating what you were saying there again, Mark? Because I think it was good. Of what's the foundation of this ethics is based in something like, I mean, you weren't advocating a specific golden rule, but you're saying something like the golden rule. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. You pretty much got what I was saying. Um, Basically, science can't tell us what the difference between right and wrong as much as our own lived experience, so to say.
Okay, interesting. Again, I like this. You've got this inclination that our lived experience. So I think you might be very much like that essay we read by the deontologist, the duty-based ethicist, seems to be most in line with your perspective. And that's, by the way, a fantastic perspective. But you. So I want to point this out because it's kind of cool because I'm trying to draw this sharp distinction, but you know, you're occupying ground in the ethical battlefield that is legitimate, right? And the deontologists are saying it's empirical, right? It's experience. It's based in experience. That's empirical, right? It's based in the experience of I have a conscience and it's revolted by this and it's drawn towards that. That's not just my emotions, Bertrand Russell. That's not just my feelings. That's like having eyesight. I can see things and I can sense the moral abhorrence of certain things and the moral the moral praiseworthiness of other things. And they would call that experience, perhaps. Experience, empirical, those are close to each other. They're more synonymous, whereas a rational principle is a totally different thing. It's fun that I want to kick this around a bit because one of the benefits of doing these courses and one of the things we're going to get out of it is really sharply cutting apart these types of distinctions, right? And so if it seems boring, I really want to focus on this because it's a valuable sharpening of the way we look at questions and the way we use the words. So that's why I'm stressing it so much. In any case, I'm going to ask you a third time just for the fun of it. And again, there's no criticism here. I don't think I'm on to something to undercut what you're saying. I think it's interesting to explore. Let me ask it straightforwardly. This golden rule kind of first principle, is that something that you understand without experience? Or do you only understand it because you've had experience and that's how you come to know it? In other words, could you just be a brain in a vat meditating on the concepts of right and wrong and come to understand something like the golden rule? Or is it something that the full degree of how you understand it is ultimately traced backable to things that you've experienced in the world? Forgive me for highlighting the focus here, Mark, on that distinction, but I want to highlight it on that so that we can kick around this empirical versus rational distinction. Just because it's an added bonus that we do that right now. So it might not have been your main point, so I'm sorry to push you on this, but
That's fine. Yeah.
how do you think we get to this first principle? Because that's what Bertrand Russell is saying. He's saying we can't use experience, we can't use science to figure out this first principle. And then he says, therefore, there's no knowing it. There's plenty of philosophers and theologians who say, well, of course, we can't use experience and science to know what the ultimate value is, but we can certainly figure it out anyway. We can use rationality, we could use divine revelation. Where would you fall on that, do you think? And you don't have to be held to it, but as you explore what you're thinking on this, where do you think the answer might lie?
I'm thinking more in life experience, where we try to humans normally take the path of least resistance, right? So if you're experiencing something that feels unfair or feels wrong, it kind of becomes part of you to think that, oh, that's something that I should avoid inflicting on other people if I'm not a psychopath, basically.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Man, this is really fun. So one of the really fun things about this ethics section that's emerging as we get into it is not only are there many different positions, but we have maybe one person from each camp represented in our class. Well, obviously not. We only have 4 people here, but this is really cool. It's cool to hear the approaches that people have. Okay, let's read another couple of paragraphs. We know where Bertrand Russell stands. Mark agrees that well, no, you actually disagree. You disagree with Bertrand Russell. You say through experience, and maybe it sounds like something like a deontological moral faculty, we can come to know what is in line with the ultimate good or not in line with it. Bertrand Russell says, look, if we could settle the question of the ultimate good, we could use science and experience and empiricism to settle all the questions of ethics, but we can't use that type of an approach to settle that ultimate question. Savad is saying he's coming in with a different attitude towards it, which is something like there's another kind of empirical test. It's the test of whether or not your nonsense actually leads to um, thriving, let's say, well, if the question of ethics is how should we live, if your ethics, if your orientation in ethics on first principles leads you to death and destruction and no future, then you were wrong. And I don't need to argue it. The cosmos is going to argue it because you're not going to be doing well. Which is a more pragmatic attitude, which is different than saying I can intellectually use my experience to figure out what's right and wrong. It's like, no, your experience is, do you or your entire culture die because you're oriented by those values? In which case, over 10,000 years, the cosmos is sort of settling the question for us, which is very different than I can be a scientist and have experiences and figure it out, which is closer to what Mark is saying, which is exactly both of those positions Bertrand Russell can't even imagine, or he hasn't even answered them yet, at least. He's saying science can't help us here. Therefore, there is no help here. Everything we're doing on first principle talk is just emotion. Okay, there's other positions we could have too, but let's move on. That's fantastic. Thank you both, by the way. Okay, questions as to values, that is to say, as to what is good or bad on its own account, independently of its effects, lie outside the domain of science, as the defenders of religion emphatically assert. So we read this and he agrees with that, but he thinks, therefore, we only have emotions. Personal feelings is the term he uses there. To make this clear, we must try to analyze the conception of the good. So let's do that now with him. It is obvious to begin with that the whole idea of good and bad has some connection with desire. That's what he thinks. Prima facie, anything that we all desire is good, and anything that we all dread is bad. If we all agreed in our desires, the matter could be left there. Ooh, interesting. Right? This is exactly like the conversation we're having a second ago, right, Savad? This is like, well, what if someone doesn't agree with you that it's better to thrive? Like, yeah, we brought up this pragmatist response, and so maybe he'll try to deal with that, and maybe he won't even imagine it. But uh, prima facie, you probably all know, but on its face, okay. If we all agreed on our desires, the matter could be left there. But unfortunately, our desires conflict. If I say, what I want is good, my neighbor will say, no, what I want is good. Ethics is an attempt, though not, I think, a successful one, to escape from this subjectivity. I shall naturally try to show, in my dispute with my neighbor, that that my desires have some quality which makes them more worthy of respect than his. If I want to preserve a right of way, I shall appeal to the landless inhabitants of the district. But he, on his side, will appeal to the landowners. I shall say, what use is the beauty of the countryside if no one sees it? He will retort, what beauty will be left if trippers are allowed to spread devastation? Each tries to enlist allies in showing that his own desires harmonize with those of other people. When this is obviously impossible, as in the case of a burglar, the man is condemned by public opinion, and his ethical status is that of a sinner. So he's describing something that some of us think might be grounds for an ethics, but he's saying, no, that's what we're doing. Have you noticed that that's just us voting with our emotions? Right? Imagine a culture where everybody said the greatest thing that you can do is steal and get away with it. We will praise you. We train you as a child on how to steal and get away with it. There were reportedly cultures that are like that. There still are today. Cultures which, again, we could make too much of that because probably not it's probably interstealing rather than intra-stealing within the culture and other things like that. Plus, the fact that it says get away with it implies that you think it's a thing that's sort of bad in and of itself, right? So we could have all sorts of responses to this. But the idea from the subjectivist is say, look, well, we've got an attitude that we all don't want to be surrounded by a bunch of murderers, and we all vote boo to murder, and we all say murder's bad, and we should punish the murderers and minimize the number of people who do that. And Bertrand Russell is saying, yeah, sure, that's what we do. We're voting. We're just expressing our emotions and we're voting. And, we condemn the people who don't go along with it, but we don't have an argument to convince them. We don't have some evidence that we could point to that says this is why you shouldn't murder. Eh, Our evidence is we all don't like you if you do it because we don't want to play by those rules. We want to play by our rules. We outnumber you. And that's the end of it. And Bertrand Russell is trying to say there's nothing settling knowledge questions there. There's just culture playing out how it plays out. And again, as Savat has hinted, there's an interesting way of swallowing that truth to the point where you come out the other side from a pragmatist attitude, but we won't get into that again. All right. Ethics is thus closely related to politics. And again, we're not agreeing with Bertrand Russell, but we're just understanding that that's what he's saying. Okay, ethics is thus closely related to politics. It is. So first he said it's obviously closely related to emotion, and now he's saying it's closely related to politics as a result. It is an attempt to bring the collective desires of a group to bear upon individuals, or conversely, it is an attempt by an individual to cause his desires to become those of his group. This latter is, of course, only possible if his desires are not obviously opposed to the general interest. The burglar will hardly attempt to persuade people that he is doing them good, though plutocrats make similar attempts and often succeed. Uh, I like that's a little clever. When our, I'm not saying I agree. I'm just that was a clever remark. The person we're reading right now, whether we agree with him or disagree with him on any specifics, is no dummy. Okay, when our desires are for things which all can employ in common, it seems not unreasonable to hope that others may concur. Thus, the philosopher who values truth, capital T, goodness, capital G, and beauty, capital B, seems to himself to be not merely expressing his own desires, but pointing the way to the welfare of all mankind. Unlike the burglar, he is able to believe that his desires are for something that has value in an impersonal sense, right? It's not subjective. But Bertrand Russell's saying, look, this is subjective. If everybody around you valued burglaring as good, you wouldn't be able to provide an argument that it wasn't good. You luckily for yourself, because you don't like it, you're in a majority if you don't like it. But that's all that's happening here. You're fooling yourself into thinking it's a truth and it's a beautiful truth and it's aimed at the good. You can fool yourself into thinking that because so many people agree with you. But where's the argument? Where's the evidence? The evidence wouldn't work in this field, he says. Okay. Ethics is an attempt to give universal and not merely personal importance to certain of our desires. All right, so he's going to, from his meta ethical mountain, now judge all of ethics and say the whole thing is just emotions. I say certain of our desires because, in regard to some of them, it is obviously impossible, as we saw in the case of the burglar. The man who makes money on the stock exchange by means of some secret knowledge does not wish others to be equally well informed. He doesn't want to universalize that. Truth, insofar as he values it, is for him a private possession, not the general human good that it is for the philosopher. The philosopher may, it is true, sink to the level of the stock jobber, as when he claims priority for a discovery. But this is a lapse in his purely philosophic capacity. He wants only to enjoy the contemplation of truth, in doing which he in no way interferes with others who wish to do likewise. Let me read this again. This is interesting. The philosopher may, it is true, sink to the level of the stock jobber, as when he claims priority for discovery. But this is a lapse in his purely philosophic capacity. He wants only to enjoy the contemplation of truth, capital T, in doing which he in no way interferes with others who wish to do likewise. He's saying one of two things, and I'm not sure what he's saying, so I'm going to move on from that. I'll have to look at it again later, or maybe we will in this discussion. Every attempt to persuade people that something is good or bad in itself, and not merely in its effects, depends upon the art of rousing feelings, not upon an appeal to evidence. That's empiricism, appeal to evidence. In every case, the preacher's skill consists in creating in others emotions similar to his own, or dissimilar if he is a hypocrite. I am not saying this as a criticism of the preacher, but as an analysis of the essential character of his activity. Okay, so let's pause and notice that he's making a specific philosophical point. He's not saying all of this other stuff isn't worthwhile. He's saying, let's have some respect for the idea of knowledge and truth, enough to admit that that's not what we're engaging in when we're engaging in the ethics of figuring out first principles. Now, we can disagree with him for sure, but to understand his position, he's saying, look, you can use reason, you can use empiricism, you can use science, as he calls it. Let's say science broadly applied, probably would be the rules of right reason applied to accurate concern for data collection and observation and experience. In any case, he's saying you can use that to settle the specific questions of ethics, but it has nothing to say when you're asking the question, what is the good? And because it has nothing to say, there is no way of getting at the actual good. What there is a political, a group of people with emotions coming together to express and try to agree with each other or persuade each other to have similar feelings of like or dislike for specific things.
May I ask a question?
Yes, certainly.
Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Perfect. So, is Russell a guy, a philosopher, that chooses external focal points as to reach a conclusion to create or create some criteria or filters as to find what is truth and good with capital T and G? Or does he also turn his mind's eye or his view towards himself, as to through his cultivation to gradually gain a new level of understanding, maybe through experience of himself, but as to find a complementary criteria and filter, maybe through conscience, maybe through whatever else, for to clarify what is good with capital Z?
Perfect. Awesome question. Thank you. We won't give an answer to that because we'll leave it open in our minds as we get to read more of him and get to know him. My suspicion is that you'll discover that he's highly inclined towards the first of those two categories. Now, he might fail in that. He might actually be more of a contemplative person than he even admits to himself, but he's highly inclined to think that the way to get to truth and knowledge is scientific, as long as you have a broad enough definition of scientific, right? Um, he's highly inclined in that direction and away from his perspective, it would be sort of the hippie-ish, hey, I'm just sort of thinking and expanding my consciousness kind of thing. He's like, I want something that's more scientific. I have respect for that, and I don't want to use the word truth for things that aren't in that category. And we saw that in his enthymeme earlier. Science can't help us on this question, therefore it's just emotion, it's just subjectivity, right? So he's kind of, now again, he's not saying we shouldn't engage in that. He's not saying we shouldn't try to, do that. Maybe he thinks there's a lot of good to that, but it isn't truth. It isn't knowledge. It isn't objectively real. It's just he would use the word just, and you might not, or other people disinclined, in the direction that he's inclined towards wouldn't say that it's pejorative, perhaps, or maybe they would find ways of defending it, but he isn't taking up those defenses. He's strongly inclined towards saying, let's not insult the idea of truth. Let's not muddy the waters about knowledge. Let's remember that empirical, objective, scientific kind of knowledge is what we're after, and we don't have it in this realm. What we have in this realm is just, he's going to insult it a little bit and say it's just subjective, emotive, politically, it's like we're all voting on what we feel about things, and that's all there is to it. There's no knowledge there, there's no revelation, there's nothing in that purely contemplative space. So I think you're going to find him strongly inclined in the first direction that you went. Let me just hit snooze on this, people, for the love of God.
May I ask another question?
Yes, please.
Okay, so as to see if I got this all correctly and properly. So Russell is a philosopher who would maybe in a way choose to be to use Aristotelian methodology, which is very close to being scientific as to reach conclusions which are philosophical notions, etc. But his application would his application's priority would be a bit stoic, as in for civic well-being, and in regards to the individual being a virtuous cosmopolitan. Cosmopolitan meaning citizen of the cosmos, universe cosmos, not the cosmopolitan, the mainstream explanation.
Okay. So as to the first part, the only reason I put a caveat when I started answering your question last time is I don't want to cartoonify a guy like Bertrand Russell. I want us to engage with him and come to a conclusion on that question through time and say, okay, well, so that's the first thing. The second thing is, if you're going to use that distinction between the Aristotelian and the Platonic, which we talk a lot about in year 2 and which we've discussed before, yeah, absolutely, you put him in the right category. Abso-freaking-lutely, he's in that category. He's in that he's in the Aristotelian tradition. We're not saying when we say that, by the way, to anybody who's listening, that he would agree with Aristotle or Aristotle would agree with him. We're talking about two basic fictilian psychological camps, two different inclinations inside. We don't have time to go into too much of that, but inside that, within philosophy, there's a dialectic happening between two opposing camps throughout the entire history of it, and you've picked the right one, I think, for where Bertrand Russell is. He's, of course, there's lots of different camps within that, and he's in one subsection that's very much leaning towards scientism. I'm not going to say we should make a cartoon of him at the same time. So who's the other guy we had to read in one of the other sections? I think I would feel very comfortable taking Clarence Darrow and saying he's just the most cartoonish version of a scientism, materialism type of person. I think we should have enough respect for a thinker like Bertrand Russell that we say, wow, he sounds highly inclined in that direction, but I'm not going to just equate him in my mind with a Clarence Darrow type. I'm going to just listen to what he has to say and try to figure out, because it's going to be sophisticated. It's going to be subtle, and there's going to be he's got his own space on this battlefield. He's not just in that cartoon space, which I'm not trying to be mean to Clarence Darrow, but from what we've read of him just in this class, he more deserves to be in the cartoon place of just, with all the pejorative senses that we have of that, in that space, than Bertrand Russell does. Bertrand Russell, Sam Harris, very similar in their attitudes and their approaches. They're not cartoonish about it. They have there's some sophistication to their approach, some seriousness about it, and some surprising things that you might not expect to be in their way of thinking if you just cartoonify it. So that's why I'm very hesitant to try to, put a title on Bertrand Russell. He's a dude. We want to get to know him better. It's not a guy, if someone wants to dismiss Clarence Darrow, I feel like you've earned it from what we've read of him so far. You don't have to. You can really like him as well, obviously. But with Bertrand Russell, we're going to just pay attention to what he's saying and say, okay, you're highly inclined in that direction, but let me try to figure out exactly what you're about, because it's not the cartoon version. Okay. Does that work? And I forgot the last part of what you said.
It does. The last part was if his priority one is the priority of intentions was the application of his findings for the well-being of the society.
Good question. So we can't answer that for Bertrand Russell. We can answer it for the focus of this essay so far, right? All we're looking at right now for Bertrand Russell is this specific essay, right? I mean, I can tell you that I think Bertrand Russell was aimed more at the well-being of, in this essay, he's saying, look, part of whatever I'm aimed at, let's have respect for the idea of truth with a capital T. Now, you can do that because you want to say, be in a cartoonish scientism realm and say everything's not true unless it comes out of my microscope or something. Fine. That's not what he's doing. And you could also say, let's have respect for truth with a capital T. And I'm highly inclined to think the scientism way of approaching it all counts as truth with a capital T and nothing else does. And say, and I care about that because I care about truth and the well being of humanity. We're not going to be able to settle that so far with Bertrand Russell with what we're reading right now. But for right now, we can say he cares about truth with a capital T in this essay so far. Right. So that let's pay attention to that question as we continue reading and see what we think about it. I want to leave it open because you're asking me about sort of not judgments plus or minus, but you're asking me to put them in a category, and I say let's keep thinking that question while and see what we discover about this fella through reading what he's writing here. Okay. Every attempt to persuade people that something is good or bad in itself is not merely in its effects depends upon the art of rousing feelings. Okay, good. And then notice he says, when a man says this is good in itself, he seems to be making a statement just as if he had said this is square or this is sweet. I believe that's a mistake. Okay, so, well, before we go that, I want to read this line again. I am not saying this as a criticism of the preacher, but as an analysis of the essential character of his activity. So notice on this last paragraph that we read, he's saying, look, you're not engaged in figuring out the truth about what's good or bad. You're engaged in trying to rally people to agree with you in your emotional, subjective attitude towards what's good and bad, because that's all you can do. Right? So he's then saying, notice I'm not criticizing people who do that. It might be a very good thing that people are doing that because otherwise we'd all just be nihilistic and we wouldn't be aimed at any good. Maybe that's fine, but I'm not criticizing them for doing it. I'm trying to hold our eyes open to the fact that that's not the same thing as figuring out what's true. Why? Because I care about true. That's all we know so far in this essay is that he's trying to show the nature of this ethical discussion of foundations and say it's emotional, it's subjective, it can't be otherwise because there's no discovery you're going to make in science that's going to tell you what the ultimate good is. It's just we are people with certain feelings. And then he goes out of his way to say, no, I'm not criticizing engaging in that. So let's just remember that. And then when a man says this is good in itself, he seems to be making a statement such as this is square or this is sweet. I believe this is a mistake. What is a mistake? What is a mistake is thinking that first statement is like the second two. That this is a meta-ethical discussion, right? He's saying when I say increasing well-being for humanity is good, it sounds like I'm saying something like for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, or human beings are primates. Like those are facts, but the first one's not a fact. He's saying it's not false or true. It's not in the realm of things that can be false or true. Okay, so he's not saying because it's not true in the sense that this here is a square could be true or false. It doesn't mean he's saying therefore it's false. He's saying it's not that kind of statement. I think that what the man really means is, I wish everybody to desire this, the well being of humanity, or rather, would that everybody desired the well being of humanity. right? It's a wish, it's an emotional vote. It's saying, I'm aimed in this direction. Who's with me? Something like that. It's that type of a statement. It's not the sort of statement that says, here's a fact I discovered and you can see it too. Even if you don't think it's true, look at my experiment, look at my investigation, look at what's real. So it's not that type of thing, which again puts it in a different category. It puts it in a category where it's not false or true. It's not the sort of thing that could be false or true. It's more of an expression of a wish or a desire or an expression of what it is that you wish others would also be aimed at. That's the type of statement it is. That's all he's trying to say. Or that's exactly what he's trying to say. If what he says is interpreted as a statement, it is merely an affirmation of his own personal wish. If, on the other hand, it is interpreted in a general way, it states nothing, but merely desires something. So it's somewhere in those, that's the extreme. That's the spectrum. It's either just him emoting or it's him wishing others would feel the same, but it's in that space. The wish as an occurrence is personal, but what it desires is universal. It is, I think, this curious interlocking of the particular and the universal, which has caused so much confusion in ethics. Oh, that's interesting. So we're not sure if we agree with him yet or not, but he's being very admirably clear about what he thinks here, and now he's starting to give a reason for why. He says, "Look, why is it that we all think a person is making a factual statement when he says something like?" Murder is wrong, euthanasia should be legal, like whatever it is that he's emoting on, which he thinks it's an emotion or it's a vote for others to have the same emotion, whatever it is, it's in that realm of the subjective and the personal and not the factual and the empirical and the scientific. He says, well, how come it seems to us like it is, right? When we hear somebody say, hey, murder is wrong, we think, damn straight it is. Right? We say, I agree. Or if somebody says abortion should be legal, we say, hell yeah, it should. Or we say, oh my God, what a horrible thing to say. That's obviously false, right? Why does it sound to us like these are statements of fact? If I'm correct, says Bertrand Russell, that they're not even in the realm of that. They're not false. They're not true. They're not concerned with false or true. They're concerned with us trying to settle. I want to be around people who feel like I do. And I think you should feel this way too. It's that type of a statement. He says, well, here's a suggestion. Maybe these are personal, subjective statements about our feelings that are interlocked with and tied to a will for universality. Like we want them to be thought of as true by everybody so that we're all inclined in the same direction. And so, because we're emoting, like if I came to you and I said, ooh, I hate Rocky Road, it's like the worst kind of ice cream. I don't want everybody to feel that way. I'm just telling you, don't buy me Rocky Road birthday cake, ice cream birthday cake for my birthday because I'll be quite disappointed, right? I'm just telling you about my feelings. And so I'm not confused about that. You don't think I'm saying, hey, people who like Rocky Road ice cream are evil, wicked, bad people aimed at the opposite of what they should be aimed at. You just think, oh, thanks for letting me know. You don't like Rocky Road. Do you like vanilla? I'm going to go buy cherry vanilla. Does that work for you? You know what I mean? Like, there's no confusion there. But he's saying, but it sounds to me, and it seems through my investigation, that we're saying something like, I don't like Rocky Road ice cream when we say, I don't like murder, right? When we say murder is wrong, really, we're just saying, I'm against that. Who's with me? Something like that. And he says, well, why is it so confusing to us? Why are we so confused into thinking that we're making a statement of fact like this is a square or bridges will fall unless they're constructed in this manner or something like that? Why do we think we're making a statement like that when really we're making a statement saying, hey, I'm one of those who's against murder. That's all I'm saying is it feels bad to me. And he says, well, I think the reason why, or part of the reason why, could be that when you make a statement like murder is wrong, you're not really just saying, I feel like murder's not a good thing, or I wish to live in a world with less of it. What you're saying is, I wish everybody felt the exact same way I do. And because there's that universal character to it, we make this elementary thought mistake of thinking, oh, you're talking about something that's true in the universal or claiming to be. But really, he's saying, you're only saying, I want as many people as possible to think this. Wouldn't it be a great world if everyone agreed with me in my feeling that Rocky Road is bad ice cream? If that's what we meant by Rocky Road is gross, I want everyone to think so too. If that implied part was in there, we might make the same mistake about personal taste expressions, right? If I say, "Ew, Rocky Road is gross," it sounds like I'm making a statement of fact, right? But it only sounds that way because I'm saying gross, right? Well, so maybe he's wrong about this as I'm investigating it, but i- i- I'm saying it's gross as a fact. But really, what I mean is I don't like it. So if you hear me say I don't like it, well, that's just a personal, singular person thing. And he says, well, when you say you don't like murder or when you say murder is wrong, you're really just saying I don't like it. I hope others don't like it either. He says, but what you're also saying is, I wish to live in a world where every human feels this way. And because that part is universal, it makes me think that what you're saying, he says, is something that's about the world. That's a factual kind of a thing. But really, it's not like that. Okay. Why don't we pause there and just I, again, my focus on this is just to understand exactly what he's saying. But now let's pause and say, well, what do you think about all that so far? I know that we might not agree with him that it's just an expression of a personal subjective inclination towards or against things, but maybe we do. Maybe we think he's onto something. Does anybody have any comments on that before we read the next paragraph? All right. The matter may perhaps become clearer by contrasting an ethical sentence with one which makes a statement. If I say all Chinese are Buddhists, I can be refuted by the production of a Chinese Christian or Mohammedan. If I say I believe that all Chinese are Buddhists, I cannot be refuted by any evidence from China, but only by evidence that I do not believe what I say. For what I am asserting is only something about my own state of mind. If now a philosopher says beauty is good, capital B and capital G, beauty is good, I may interrupt him. I'm sorry, I may interpret him as meaning either would that everybody loved the beautiful, which corresponds to all Chinese are Buddhists, or I wish that everybody loved the beautiful, which corresponds to I believe that all Chinese are Buddhists. Okay. All right. Let's move on. The first of these makes no assertion, but expresses a wish. Since it affirms nothing, it is logically impossible that there should be evidence for or against it, or for it to possess either truth or falsehood. The second sentence, instead of being merely optative, does make a statement. But it's one about the philosopher's state of mind, and it could only be refuted by evidence that he does not have the wish that he says he has. This second sentence does not belong to ethics, but to psychology or biography. The first sentence, which does belong to ethics, expresses a desire for something, but asserts nothing. Wow, what a fun so he had hinted at the idea that it's this universal desire, but now he's also fleshing out another way in which this is happening. He says there's an ambiguity to moral statements, right? I hate murder or murder is wrong means something like I'm the sort of person who wants to live in a world where everybody feels like boo murder. Let's not do that. Now, that can be that can mean two different things and it seems to mean them both at the same time. So that ambiguity makes us think that's a factual statement. Now, notice what he's doing here. He's not saying murder is wrong is a factual statement. What he's saying is, well, when you say murder is wrong, let's reinterpret that. What that really means is, boo, I'm against murder. That statement can be interpreted in two different ways. That statement is ambiguous, right? So he's not even analyzing the first statement now. He's saying, I've recognized that the first statement really means the second statement, but that statement itself could be understood as two different things. It could be an expression of a wish. I wish that everyone was against murder. I want to live in a world where there's as few people as possible who feel good about murder. Okay. That's a wish. That's not a fact. That's not a statement that you're not even claiming it. You're just saying, hey, wouldn't it be better if, or not even that, that would be a statement of fact. You're saying, ooh, I hope people don't like murder. It's a hope, it's a wish. On the other hand, there's another way of interpreting it, which is you telling the world, I'm one of the people that doesn't like murder. That is a factual statement. You could be a secret serial killer, and we could discover all the evidence of that and say, well, you told the world you were against murder. What a hypocrite you were. That was factually inaccurate. You loved murder. You just wanted other people to think you didn't. Right. So that's a factual statement that could be true or could be false. And he's saying, yeah, the factual version of that statement can be true or false, but it's just about one person. It's not a fact about murder. It's just a fact about his attitude towards murder, right? So again, he's not even talking about the first statement, murder is wrong. What he's saying is that statement, murder is wrong, really reduces to or is properly reinterpreted as, ooh, look at me in public saying to other people, I don't like murder. That statement could mean two different things. It could mean one, I'm engaged in the action that's trying to get other people to feel this way too. I wish it was the case that other people also didn't like murder. Or it could be interpreted both at the same time as you saying, I'm one of the people that doesn't like murder. Well, the first one is not factual. It's not in the nature of being factual. It couldn't be true and it couldn't be false. It's just you wishing other people felt that way and trying to encourage them to feel that way. Fine. That's just, it's true that you are expressing that emotion. The second one is you're making a claim that could be true or false, which is I'm one of the people that doesn't like murder. That could be false or it could be true, but it's just about one person. So the statement is ambiguous. It means two different things or could mean either of them. And the degree to which it's factual is it's completely specific. It's personal. It's particular to you. It's not about the world. It's not about the reality of the nature of murder or something like that. It's just about you. It's a factual statement about you. Like he says, it belongs to the realm of psychology or biology to figure out if that's true or false about you. The other one is not even anything like a factual statement. It's you expressing the wish that, all right, so we get it. I don't have to keep beating a dead horse. Okay, ethics. If the above analysis is correct, contains no statements. Standing in his meta-ethical realm, looking at the entire conversation of ethics. Should you pull the lever to change the track that the tram is on? Should surgeons perform surgeries on people of this type without a consent form? Like every practical and hypothetical ethical question, every argument about duty, and here's how we can rationally come to it, utility, and this is the greatest good for the greatest number. That whole messy, loud, imagine like a whole battlefield full of people making all sorts of arguments. We must find out what God wants, and it's a divine dictate theory, or be a virtuous person and look around to find people that are admirable and figure out what's like all these conversations that people are having and all these different camps and all these different arguments. He's up like the Grinch on his mountain looking down at these who's who are engaged in Whoville and all these arguments. He says, look at them all emoting. They're not making factual statements at all. That's what he's doing. He says, ethics, if the above analysis is correct, my view that I've put forward here, contains no statements. You're not even making claims that could be argued about. You're just booing and cheering each other or something, or trying to align all your boos and cheers towards the same things. So it contains no statements, whether true or false, but consists of desires of a certain general kind, namely such as are concerned with the desires of mankind in general, and of gods, angels, and devils, if they exist. Science can discuss the causes of desires and the means for realizing them, but it cannot contain any genuinely ethical sentences because it is concerned with what is true or false. So this is one of the reasons why I hesitated to put Bertrand Russell into a camp. Let's look very specifically at the claims he's making only in this one paragraph here. This is kind of an interesting little piece of the battlefield he's carved out for himself in metaethics. He says, all those everybody talking ethics, they're making no statements. None of them can be true. None of them can be false. They're emoting. They're dealing with their differences of their feelings. That's all they're doing. That's fine. It might be a great thing to do. I'm not even picking on them for it. I'm just saying they're not talking about things that could be true or false. Science, clearly, he thinks that's the only way to get to true with a capital T. Science can do a lot. It can tell us why we have those emotions in the first place. It can tell us why we're aimed at certain things. It can maybe, if there's gods and angels and devils, it can tell us if they exist. It can tell us why they're aimed at the things that they're aimed at. You can go and investigate it. You can find it in your DNA. You can see it in some cosmic principle, perhaps. Who knows? And it can tell us the best way to get to our aims, right? Given the fact that you're aiming at, let's say you think the best good would be to populate the other planets or something, or to increase or decrease suffering as much as possible. Whatever your aim is, it can say, I know why you feel that way. I looked at your genes, I looked at your culture, I understood scientifically, psychology and biology and all these things. Maybe I can figure out why you feel that way. And given that you feel that way, I can tell you, well, this action is going to lead to not getting there, but these actions are more likely to lead to getting there, right? It can help us out a ton. But you know what it can't do? It can't tell us that we should be aimed at the things we're aimed at. It can't tell us what is the right thing to be aimed at. Because the right thing to be aimed at is not the sort of thing that can be true or false. Let's return to that in a moment. No, let's pause and go around the room. What do y'all think of that? Who here suspects that he might be onto something? That there might be a germ of truth in what he's saying here? That science, even if we don't agree with his idea that it's the only way to know things, or if we do, that science isn't going to be able to give us sort of like, hey, we discovered it. You should all be working on increasing the population. That's the ultimate good. You should all be working on decreasing suffering. That's the ultimate good. You should all be working on colonizing other planets. That's the ultimate good. Like, is science ever going to be able to tell us something like that? I suspect all three of you would say no. That's all he's saying there. He's saying science ain't going to help you on that question.
Okay, I have a question.
Please.
I'm just rereading this. Science can discuss the cause of desires and the means for realizing them, but it cannot contain any genuinely ethical sentences because it is concerned with what is true or false.
And to him, ethical sentences mean nothing more than boo, I don't like this, or yay, that's the thing we should do. That's all they mean. They don't, or yay, I'm for this, or boo, I'm against that. That's all they mean. And so they can't be true and they can't be false. And so science can't help us with them.
When he's saying because it is concerned with what is true, I could be wrong here in how I'm interpreting this. He's saying with right, science is true or false. But I guess he is saying, so I was going to say, well, that it's like assuming that those who are performing science are ethical.
No, no, I don't think he's doing that.
Okay.
Well, maybe he is. Maybe, God, I just got to make sure this stops sending me things. Can I say turn off? Okay.
Right. It's
Okay,
saying
so say that again.
science cannot contain any genuinely ethical sentences because it is concerned with what is true or false.
Yeah. I wonder if you're onto something there. He clearly thinks you should be aimed at what's true with a capital T. He keeps using it.
Right, but it's like if someone is conducting this experiment, I don't know. The thing I think of is like, okay, then there's meta-analysis. You take all these different studies, you put them together, but you put some to the side because for whatever reason,
Yeah.
right? That could be, well, if I include those, it's not going to get to the result
That I want.
that I want or whoever is funding this wants,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yep.
It would be, so I have a hard time with him saying that is okay. The science is it's concerned with what is only true or false, but it's more complex than that. It's not as simple
So,
because there's people who are involved,
okay. Okay. I see. Yep.
and
Okay.
then you have their right, and then it's are those people who are performing this science where are I don't know
Yep.
are
No.
where they're at.
Totally with you. So, what I want to do is that this is awesome. Today, unlike most days, we've now got 3 opportunities to bring in other rules of thinking and how to do philosophy and definitions of terms. You just brought up an awesome one that we can talk about. First of all, I agree completely with what you're saying, and we could spend hours and hours and hours talking about how it is the case. The test, when we're trying to understand a thinker, should be this. Could Bertrand Russell say everything he just said and then agree with everything we just said as well without contradiction? And I think yes. Okay. So I don't think what Bertrand Russell is saying is every scientist is ethical and aimed at the truth. Everything they do is good science. Bertrand Russell might think that 99% of scientists are definitely aimed at the truth and doing great things, but he could just as easily think, oh, well, yeah, but 99% of people engaged in science are total bullshit hypocrites and not aimed at anything good and aren't helping us get to the truth at all. What he means by science is science rightly done. Right. What he means is that, and that's all that matters because when we're asking the question, what is it that he thinks? Okay. Now, all right, good. So that's an awesome test, and it's a really good test for inference. So and it goes well with what we talked about before. An enthymeme, we said, was a syllogism where the unspoken, non-explicit premise or conclusion is necessarily the case that the author thinks that since he thinks the other two. Inferences are like that. If it's a correct inference, it means he must think it given everything else he thinks. I think the idea that all scientists are aimed at the truth is not an inference of anything he was saying. Right? I think he could easily think that, but he could easily think the opposite and not have to change a word of what we've read so far, right? So that is a really cool test. What I like to do is say, okay, if we're wondering if this author thinks X, all we have to do to make a judgment on that is say, given everything we read about him, could he then also, right after writing that, agree with everything we just said or disagree with it? And if he can do both, it means it's not an inference. It's not something that's actually implied in what he was saying. Right? So
Yeah.
that's a cool thinking test, and that's a good standard to use. So having said that, I agree with you completely. Bertrand Russell might agree with you completely, right? He could, given everything he said. He could say, look, you guys don't even know the half of it. I've been dealing with scientists my whole life. They're all full of shit. That doesn't matter. He could think that. He might not think that. What he's saying is science, if you are doing it properly, could help you in these realms, but not this realm. Is that fair?
Yeah.
That being said, you just opened up a really fun other discussion, and we'll probably have to just talk about. All right, I mean, so the public understanding of science goes through so many filters that by the time people are talking about it, it has zero quality of anything reliable. Even if science was originally reliable as a method of getting to things, none of it is scientific or reliable by the time people are talking about it. And there's a lot of good reasons for that. Meta studies, you pointed out, is one element of it. The simple fact that nobody knows what scientists think. What they know is what the 3 scientists CNN decided to put up on a platform think. That's all you know. You didn't have equal time for all their colleagues who disagree with them, right? So, so in any case, um, there's a lot we can say about that. But Bertrand Russell, given everything he said so far, could completely agree with it and even expand it further, possibly. Or he might disagree with it. I mean, we just don't know because I don't think it's entailed in what he's saying.
Okay.
Which is fantastic. So, but that helps us to clarify. And that's the right way to clarify, to say, now, wait a minute, here's an important point. Could he agree with that, given what he said? Could he disagree with it, given what he said? If the answer to both is yes, then he's not implying it. And that helps us to understand what he is saying. What he's saying is, look, let's imagine we've done no good science so far. Science could, if we did it properly, get us to some answers on why we're inclined to have certain values, and it can give us some help on attaining those aims. But it can never tell us what we should be aiming at, because that's not a question for science, because it's not a factual statement, it's an emotional statement. An analogy would be something like, I really, and not only do I, but most people in my culture and most people who are exposed to it think that there's something profoundly beautiful and aesthetically valuable about the statue of David or Venus or whatever. Say, okay, that's fine. You think it's beautiful. Are you making a factual statement? Are you saying, like, factually it's the case? Can you give an argument and provide some evidence to a person who looks at it and goes, whatever, that looks ugly to me. I prefer a different kind of art. I mean, you're not making a factual statement. You're saying, I feel this way. That's all you're saying. And science could help to discover why you feel that way. There's symmetry in it. Here's your genetics. Here's your emotional release of certain chemicals based on trigger. Like, we could do psychology and biology and anthropology and cultural studies, and we could try to figure out why you feel that way scientifically. And we could use science to develop techniques for making the sort of art that you will feel that way about and say, wow, this is so beautiful. But he's saying, but science can't tell you what is beautiful or not, because that's not really a matter of fact. It's just how you feel.
Okay.
All right, we're not agreeing with that, but that's a nice analogy for what he's saying about ethics here. Okay, good job, by the way. That's fucking awesome. All right, let's do this so we can wrap this up. The theory which I have been advocating is a form of the doctrine which is called subjectivity of values. This doctrine consists in maintaining that if two men differ about values, there is not a disagreement as to any kind of truth, but a difference of taste. This is where we get the phrase no accounting for taste. If one man says oysters are good and another says, I think they are bad, we recognize that there is nothing to argue about. The theory in question holds that all differences as to values are of this sort, although we do not naturally think them so when we are dealing with matters that seem to us more exalted than oysters. The chief ground for adopting this view is the complete impossibility of finding any arguments to prove that this or that has intrinsic value. If we all agreed, we might hold that we know values by intuition. So now he's going to start to attack the deontology and maybe Mark's attitude, where he says, look, if it was the case that you could just have a faculty to know, then why are there disagreements at all? We all agree that the sky is blue because we have eyes. Why is it that some of us, like, if some of us were saying, I think it's red, and other people were saying, I think it's yellow, and other people were saying it changes color all the time or whatever, it's like, do you really have eyes that can settle the question, in a sense? Now, obviously, there's obviously a response to that in that analogy there, but he thinks that wouldn't be the case. If we all had a moral faculty, it would tell us the same thing, because it would be of something real, and so it wouldn't just be relative to our upbringing and our emotional whatever it's based in. He thinks that, but obviously that isn't the case about the sky, and yet we still have eyes, and the sky is real, and it has color in a sense, right? So maybe he's wrong about that, but let's discuss that more in a moment. All right, we cannot prove to a colorblind man that grass is green. Oh my God, he's saying all this. I should just read it. If we all agreed, we might hold we know values by intuition. So we cannot prove to a colorblind man that grass is green and not red, but there are various ways of proving to him that he lacks the power of discrimination which most men possess. Whereas in the case of values, there are no such ways. and disagreements are much more frequent than in the case of colors. Okay, so he answers our response from that side too. Since no way can be even imagined for deciding a difference as to values, the conclusion is forced upon us that the difference is one of taste, not one as to any objective truth. All right, so if somebody said, look, we do have disagreements about color. What about a colorblind person, right? Anybody who tells me they think murder is good, they sound to me like a psychopath, a person who's just has a damaged moral faculty. Most of us with eyes, we see that grass is green. This guy's colorblind. That's all I'm saying. He says, yeah, but you could argue to the colorblind man that he lacks a capacity to make a distinction. You could say, look, we're all saying we see something here that you don't see. And we could prove it in a way, right? We're not just pretending. And with moral disagreements, they're much more frequent, he thinks. It's like, oh, there's like this whole chaotic ocean of some people thinking murder's good or bad, or well, maybe not that one, but there's so many disagreements about everything else that it makes me wonder if we've got a faculty that's pointing us towards a reality, or whether or not this is more the nature of people having certain inclinations and emotions that they're trying to sort out with each other. The consequences of this doctrine are considerable. So now that he's made this case, he says, "Look, I understand that what I'm saying is a has consequences, pretty profound ones. In the first place, there can be no such thing as sin in an absolute sense. What one man calls sin, another man might call virtue. And though they may dislike each other on account of this difference, neither can convict the other of an intellectual error. An intellectual error. Punishment cannot be justified on the ground that the criminal is wicked, but only on the ground that he has behaved in a way which others wish to discourage. Hell, you see how interconnected this is with our determinism free will, which we started with, right? They were dealing with the same questions. Okay. Um, hell is a place of punishment for sinners. That becomes quite irrational. Makes no sense because there's no such thing as a sinner. There's just different people feeling different ways about different actions. In the second place, it is impossible to uphold the way of speaking about values, which is common among those who believe in cosmic purpose, capital C, capital P. Their argument is that certain things which have been evolved as are good, which have been evolved are good, and therefore the world must have had a purpose, which was ethically admirable. In the language of subjective values, this argument becomes some things in the world are to our liking, and therefore they must have been created by a being, capital B, with our tastes, whom he, or capital W, whom therefore we also like, and who, capital W, consequently is good. Seems fairly evident that if creatures having likes and dislikes were to exist at all, they were pretty sure to like some things in their environment, since otherwise they would find life intolerable. Our values have been evolved along with the rest of our constitution, and nothing as to any original purpose can be inferred from the facts that they are what they are. I'm just going to keep reading because we're running short on time. We're going to wrap this up real quickly. Those who believe in objective values, right, reality out there, often contend that the view which I have been advocating has immoral consequences. This seems to me to be due to faulty reasoning. He says there's nothing, so my consequences are of my idea are pretty profound. It means there's no such thing as sin. It means there can't, it's irrational to think that there's a hell to punish the sinners when really sin is a mistake in our minds because you just like something different than I like, and that's all there is to it. And in the second place, there isn't an ultimate purpose to anything. Okay, fine. But I don't think one of the consequences of my doctrine is that it is itself immoral or promotes immorality. So why? Well, I think it's a mistake to think so. Here's why. There are, as has already been said, certain ethical consequences of the doctrine of subjective values, of which the most important is the rejection of vindictive punishment and the notion of sin, quote unquote. But the more general consequences, which are feared, such as the decay of all sense of moral obligation, are not to be logically deduced. Moral obligation, if it is to influence conduct, must consist not merely of a belief, but of a desire. It must have desire, it must be subjective. The desire, I may be told, is the desire to be good in a sense which I no longer allow. But when we analyze, but when we analyze the desire to be good It generally resolves itself into a desire to be approved, or alternatively, to act so as to bring about certain general consequences which we desire. We have wishes which are not purely personal. And if we had not, no amount of ethical teaching would influence our conduct except through fear of disapproval. The sort of life that most of us admire is one which is guided by large impersonal desires. Such desires can no doubt be encouraged by example, education, and knowledge, but they can hardly be created by the mere abstract belief that they are good, nor discouraged by an analysis of what is meant by the word good. Let's pause for a second. What he's saying is everything that you originally valued in the idea of ethics is still in my system. I've gotten rid of some illusions, but it turns out that wanting the approval of other people, wanting to sort out, uh, feeling the same as people around you, and voting for yes this or no that, all of that stuff is actually what influences people to be aimed towards the similar things that you're aimed towards, or to find a common aim at least. And actually, all the discussion about why it's officially, objectively, actually good or bad does nothing for that because it's not that type of thing. So it doesn't actually persuade anybody. So all the things that were ever persuasive in ethics are still just as persuasive. I've just gotten rid of the illusion of something else which wasn't actually helping to begin with. I think he's clearly not correct about this, by the way, but maybe he is. In any case, it's interesting. What he's saying is everything that you're afraid because I'm saying, look, it's not like that. And, oh my God, we have no ethics anymore. He goes, no, we have everything that ever actually appealed to changing our behavior and making us be aimed at everything you think is valuable about ethics. We still have that. I just got rid of the illusion, which, by the way, if you have that illusion, that stuff does nothing, right? If somebody isn't appealable to the conversation about voting about how we feel in this emotive sort of way, the only way to change their behavior is to put them in jail. But there are no arguments to convince them, right? It isn't that type of thing. So let's get rid of that mistake, and then we can go on engaging in trying to aim at the same thing together, or figure out what we are aimed at, or how to get to the things that we just happen to be aimed at, or whatever. But we never were persuading anybody with any of these other arguments in the first place, he thinks. And also, whatever, let's move on. When we contemplate the human race, we may desire that it should be happy or healthy or intelligent or warlike and so on. Okay, any one of these desires, if it is strong, will produce its own morality. But if we have no such general desires, our conduct, whatever our ethic may be, will only serve social purposes insofar as self interest and the interests of society are in harmony. It is the business of wise institutions to create such harmony as far as possible. And for the rest, whatever may be our theoretical definition of value, we must depend upon the existence of impersonal desires. When you meet a man with whom you have a fundamental ethical disagreement, for example, if you think that all men count equally while he thinks a certain class is alone important, you will find yourself no better able to cope with him if you believe in objective values than if you do not. In either case, you can only influence his conduct through influencing his desires. If you succeed in that, his ethic will change, and if not, not. Okay, that's interesting. So he's setting it up to say, look, this we're talking about what we should be aimed at. We're making a mistake to think that that is grounded in something objective. What it actually is, I'm observing with a clear head, is just us emoting and expressing our emotions and trying to come in line with similar aims with each other by saying, "Boo, I don't like this," or "Yay, that's the right thing to like." He says, "Notice when you thought it was grounded in something objective and you came across someone who thought differently than you had no argument to persuade him. The only thing you ever did was pretend you were making arguments, but really you were appealing to his emotions to try to make him see how pleasant it would be to aim at the same thing you're aiming at. And if you convinced him in that way, convinced him, right? You're not having a disagreement about a fact, you're just persuading him to care more about X than Y, or X rather than the anti X. That was all the ethical accomplishments you've ever had. That's all that could ever exist. And we still have all of those. All we need are institutions and education and contemplating these things not as though they're facts, but to be persuasive and rhetorical and to create the image of the better story of what we should be aimed at. That's the quality of the type of thing it is, which by the way, there's kind of it's kind of surprising how much overlap there is between this attitude, right? We were asking the question, Alana was asking the question, is he like a scientismist? It's like, well, he wants to preserve truth, capital T, and knowledge, capital K, in this other realm. But the pragmatist would say, no, this is truth. This thing you're describing here that gets us to go, no, it's not. He's the truth is this kind of thing. But it doesn't mean he's abolishing this other thing, right? He's saying, well, that's all valuable. Everything you ever valued about that, you can still value and we can still have it. Maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong, but just notice it's not truth. It's not science. It's not that type of thing. Maybe he's right, maybe he's not, but he's not a cartoon. So let's really wrestle with it. All right. When you meet a man with whom you have a fundamental disagreement, if you succeed in that, his ethic will change, right? What are you succeeding in? You're succeeding in changing his emotional aim. And then when that aim changes, all of his ethics change, right? Because now what's good is what helps me get to this rather than what helps me get to this other thing. And that's all that's all ethical discussions can do, is try to align you to aim in the same direction. Or in a direction different than the one you were aimed at. Once you change that, then all of a sudden you find that all your ethical values change. The things that were good were getting me over here. Now those are bad because they're getting me away from over here, but I've changed what I'm aiming at. He says, science and facts and objective truth can't tell you what you should aim at. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try to aim at things and convince people to aim at things. The ethics change immediately when you do that. And that's all you ever were able to affect, because that's always been the nature of the conversation to begin with, even though much of the conversation was about it being objectively true. Okay. Last two paragraphs here. Some people feel that if a general desire, say for the happiness of mankind, has not the sanction of absolute good, it is in some way irrational. So some people are dissatisfied with everything I just said. He's noticing, right? Well, I'm telling you, that's all you've ever had, and you still got it. Don't worry. We're not abolishing ethics. We're just understanding what it really is. It's not factual and objective. He says, okay, some people will not be convinced by what I just said. They feel that, if we're all aiming at this just because we feel like we should be aiming at that, it's irrational. There's no reason why we should be, and there's nothing real about the whole ethical thing. This is due to a lingering belief in objective values. A desire cannot in itself be either rational or irrational. It may conflict with other desires and therefore lead to unhappiness. It may rouse opposition in others and therefore be incapable of gratification. But it cannot be considered irrational merely because no reason can be given for feeling it. We may desire A because it is a means to B. But in the end, when we have done with mere means, we must come to something which we desire for no reason, but not on that account irrationally. All systems of ethics embody the desires of those who advocate them. But this fact is concealed in a mist of words. Our desires are, in fact, more general and less purely selfish than most moralists imagine. If it were not so, no theory of ethics would make moral improvement possible. It is, in fact, not by ethical theory, but by the cultivation of large and generous desires through intelligence, happiness, and freedom from fear that men can be brought to act more than they do at present in a manner that is consistent with the general happiness of mankind. Whatever our definition of the good, capital G, in quotes, and whether we believe it to be subjective or objective, those who do not desire the happiness of mankind will not endeavor to further it, while those who desire it will do what they can to bring it about. It's a meta-ethical essay, right? He's talking about the ethical conversation. And he's saying, I want you to see clearly that even if you have all the best arguments in the world and the most persuasive, convincing case for the objective reality of your ultimate good, if you as a subject are not really aiming at it, you're not going to actually do anything for that ethic. And if you as a subject are aiming at it, You don't have to believe it's objectively true. You're just aiming at it. Go use objective truth to figure out how to get there. It's not going to actually help you figure out what you're feeling. What you're feeling ultimately, like A leads to B leads to C. Well, what's the ultimate aim? Well, that has to be reducible to I am inclined in this direction and nothing more. I feel like going this way. I think we should have a world where people want to increase happiness. Okay, I'm aimed at happiness. I don't have an argument for that. It comes down ultimately to the grounding is ultimately for all these ethics, the grounding is ultimately my subjective feeling. This is the direction I'm aiming. And he's not saying, therefore, stop aiming at things because it's not true. He's saying, recognize that that's the nature of that kind of question. It's about aiming. And you know what? You can have all the objective arguments in the world for why this is the right thing to aim at. But if you're not actually aiming at it, what, how are you going to call that good? You're not aiming at it, right? Maybe you're making arguments so that people will be confused by thinking it's subjective, and then they're not going to be aiming at it either. That's what in mythopoetry and prophetic and religious traditions, that's called idol worship, right? You can write all the books you want about the objective reality of this being the good, and then if everybody agrees with you, they missed out on the good. Why? Because you were aimed at something that it wasn't. It wasn't objective. You weren't aimed at the thing you were talking about. You were aimed at saying, I am aimed at it. Sounds like the same thing, but he's trying to say it ain't the same thing. And so let's get rid of this confusion. Notice that Bertrand Russell's saying, let's get rid of this confusion, not so that we can be free of all these ethical constrictions that were enslaving us to aim at certain things. He says, no, no, no. Let's get rid of the confusion so we could actually be aimed at it. Let's understand the nature of this thing. It's an aiming. It doesn't have an argument for it. Be the sort of person that's aimed at it if you are, and be as persuasive as you can be to get others to aim at it if you can. But don't make the mistake of thinking it's like a scientific truth that you should be aimed at. It's not of that nature. It's an interesting argument and it's an interesting position. It has surprising overlaps with pragmatism. It has surprising overlaps with, as he said in the beginning, very many religious attitudes towards the nature of good, right? They agree that you can't use science to figure out what's good or not. Often they do. And he says, yeah, but they don't agree with me that it's just an aiming or just a feeling or something like that. They think you can use revelation to get to the objective truth. I'm trying to tell you it's not objective in its nature. Yeah, he could be right, he could be wrong, but his position is not cartoonish. It has really surprising overlaps with uh when I say surprising, what I mean is it has overlaps with camps that you'd be surprised to think a subjectivist would have overlap with. So it's not a cartoonish thing, which maybe a Clarence Darrow type might fall into, or maybe not. Maybe I'm being unfair to Clarence, but in any case, it could be that he's confused. It could be that he wants to have those things because there is an objective, real truth within him, and he's trying to deny it. Right? I mean, we're not agreeing with him or not, or disagreeing with him. What we're saying is there's something that's not cartoonish about his attitude, and he's making a case for subjectivity. All right, we're going to end this. I'm going to say that, obviously the next essay that's coming up is going to be a pretty good philosophical argument, I think, against this whole position. There's a challenge that we talked about in the introduction to this subjectivity attitude that you really can just translate murder is wrong to I feel bad about murder, that those are not obviously equivalent statements. And so we're probably going to deal with that soon as we continue Edwards's desire to explore the nature of this. Is it subjective? Is it objective? But we got to see the objectivist case from a specific deontological perspective in the first essay. Now we've got to see a pretty strong subjectivist case from Bertrand Russell. And so I'm going to shut up before we end this and say, any thoughts? I know we're nearing our second hour, and I know that we love to talk a lot more once I turn the stream off. But let's talk.
Well, he certainly has a point in saying that your ethics are based upon what you're aiming at, and I think that could be. I think he provided a good argument for it, because based on, like I said, what you're aiming for, well, right, those ethics would change to match to what you're aimed at.
Yeah, that's such an interesting observation. Isn't that the way it is? It's such an interesting observation to say, look, you change what a person's aimed at, and suddenly their 10,000 positions they used to have are all the opposite of what they used to have. It's like, holy crap, that doesn't sound like a person who's reasoning through each of those positions. It's like those positions all line up with what I'm aimed at. And well, that's it does seem to be like that. And that does seem to be a pretty good, diagnosis of the quality of a conversation that's much more subjective than maybe we're pretending it is when we're talking, perhaps.
Yeah, the point reminds me of the saying that we don't have any of our own opinions.
The point reminds you of someone saying we don't have any of our.
We
Oh, yeah,
don't have
right.
any of our own opinions, right? It's what we're aiming for. Why are we aiming at it, right? So it's, we think, or we may believe it's, well, I'm aiming at this because it's part of the culture, or I think it make you pretty introspective. I think that of saying, look, it's purely based on where you're aiming at. And I said it's a good point. And then it just, well, why am I aiming at it? Why are we aiming? Who decided to aim at this, and who is it really benefiting?
Let's talk about. It's so funny because he's there's a germ. His position is completely antithetical to the pragmatist approach, because the pragmatists want to say that's what truth is. And he wants to say that's exactly what truth isn't. Truth is this objective thing. It's this thing over here. But that germ of truth is pretty powerful. So, do you remember the last or one of the final scenes of the third Matrix trilogy? There's this scene where it's the nihilistic Agent Smith always saying this is inevitable. This is inevitable. It comes to an end. It's inevitable to Neo, and they're fighting. I've seen the future. You lose. You must be able to see it by now. What does he call him? He calls him Mr. Anderson. You must be able to see it by now. You can't win. You can't win. It's inevitable. You must be able to see it by now. Why? Why? Why do you persist? And the answer isn't an argument. Neo gets up. He looks at him. He goes, because I choose to. And that infuriates Agent Smith. But what's being depicted there quite impressively dramatically, and it's the philosophical thing we're talking about right now, is characterological. It's saying you are the sort of person aimed at everything coming to an end. You are the embodiment of the character of the nihilist. I don't mean in literature. I mean within the framework of the fiction of the literature. Agent Smith is being the thing aimed at bringing it all to an end. He has no argument for why Neo should also feel that way. And Neo doesn't provide an argument for why he shouldn't feel that way. He says, that's what you are, and this is what I am. I'm the one who chooses to aim at what I think is good, which is the opposite of what you think is good. And you have no argument to convince me otherwise, and I'm not providing one to you. This is who I am, is what he's saying. Right. That's the idea that this is characterological, and that germ of truth is certainly something that Bertrand Russell is trying to highlight here. Um, or I shouldn't call it a germ of truth because I'm taking a position. That's the notion that the pragmatists latched onto and went full circle to say that's what we mean by truth. It's a way of being in the world. It's not a proposition. Bertrand Russell says no, truth, it has to be propositional. So there's no truth there, but there's something super valuable there. There's something about inclinations and aims and characterological realities there. And I think he is aiming at it that way. He doesn't want to lose it for sure, even if maybe his theory does lose it and he's denying that it loses it. I don't know. But he's certainly overlapping in his instinct to say that's valuable. So there's two sides to the coin. There's no argument for being nihilistic. There's no argument that can get you out of it either. It's what you are. I am the one aimed at things being good as I see it. You're the one who thinks what would be good is if everything came to an end. That's how you see it. There's no argument for why I should agree with you. You don't have a powerful argument. You just have an attitude. You have an inclination. But then the mythopoetic approachers, the theologians, not of the philosophical type. What I mean is the prophetic religious traditions understand that as truth, right? When Christ says, "I am the truth," he's saying, because I choose to. He's saying, I am a manifestation of the character, the way of being that is truth. That is, to the analytical way of thinking, almost blasphemy. To Bertrand Russell, it's like, how dare you say truth is something like what I'm aimed at? My feelings are true. Like, no, your feelings are relative to other people's feelings. You can't settle that in an argument. So therefore, we're not dealing with truth. We're dealing with something maybe deep and profound and valuable, but don't sully the name of truth by calling it something like that. But there's certainly with the pragmatists, the existentialists for sure, which partly gave birth to the pragmatist way of thinking. For the existentialists, for Kierkegaard, for Nietzsche, for Socrates, the ultimate truth, the source of all truth, the arche, as Socrates is aimed at, truth qua truth. He's using capital T as well as Bertrand Russell. For them, this thing is a character. It's a way of being, and it's a personality. Bertrand Russell's like, come on, truth is something you can argue for. You can't argue for it. It's not that kind of thing. But that doesn't mean he's against the characterological. He just doesn't want to call it truth. So it's not clear. It's not clear that he's an enemy of that sort of thing. That's something to notice. And when Jordan Peterson had conversations with Sam Harris, he had that understanding. He said, "Look, Sam Harris is claiming that there's no such thing as truth that you can get from being aimed at an ultimate good and away from an ultimate evil, but he does think it. So from my way of understanding, he is still a manifestation of of the type of personality, or he could be, let's probe and see. It seems to me like he's a manifestation of the type of personality that I would call the truth. He would hate saying that. That's fine. Who cares what he it doesn't matter, right? In the same sense as Bertrand Russell is saying. You can be on the Sam Harris and Bertrand Russell side of this and say, well, of course that doesn't matter. What the way Bertrand Russell ended it was, look, you can have all the objective language that I think is faulty about what the right thing to aim at is. If you're not aimed at it, who gives a shit, right? Well, that's sort of the main point from the other side of this too. So the debate between these two approaches, let's say the existential and the analytical, they're on a common ground, possibly, or at least some of the people on both sides have common ground that is antithetical to the other way of being, the nihilistic attitude. So that's worth observing. It's really, I think it's worth observing that, right or wrong on that question, even some of the people on the other side, quote unquote, from the existentialists on that issue are also potentially manifesting the right orientation towards truth with a capital T. How about that for an insight? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, because they need to be really aimed at it and have it and live it out for it to matter and for them to reach it, and they need to be aiming at the right thing of where they believe it's going to get them.
Yeah, I think that's right. So this has been a really fun time because we've got to talk about enthymemes, we've got to talk about tests for inferences, we got to talk about being careful about definitions and being sharp in our focus on words like empiricism and rationalism and all of that. But also, that's all pretty rich for Bertrand Russell is obviously a valuable guy to be reading. And it comes out in those ways as well. But also, we spend some time capping it off by looking at how he ends this essay and say, now wait a minute, he might be right, or the existentialists might be right. But if the existentialists are right, he also might be right according to their analysis too, right? Like he might be being the right thing. And if he's right, they might be misusing the word truth, but also he's not saying, therefore they're not doing the ultimately profound, good, important thing or something of more value potentially. Again, it's at least open as a possibility. So one of the best things about this is that we're looking at some sophisticated thinkers, and as we survey this field, occasionally we come across someone who we don't want to too easily think of them as cartoonishly in some camp that they're not in. And I think we should keep those questions we had before about, well, how does, maybe there's some tension, and maybe Bertrand Russell's just contradicting himself, and maybe he can't really resolve these things, or maybe he can, and maybe he's ultimately right. Whatever. Let's keep open the question of where exactly he fits on this thing as we continue reading. We'll be seeing more from him in future for sure. All right, we're going to end it there and go into the after conversation. Thanks to everybody who's watching on the various platforms.